Hello. Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you everyone here at the museum. It's been such a pleasure working here for the past couple months. So tonight I'm going to talk about George Ohr, who has been a hero of mine for many, many years. But I thought at first I'd give you a little background of myself. I'm going to talk about his history, and I thought maybe it'd be good to know a little bit of mine within the discussion. Like Emily said, I'm from Boston, and I went to RISD, and I was a ceramics major there. And after school, I left for a year, and I went to Mexico City, and I studied figurative folk ceramics down there. I had an NEA grant. And then I moved to New York and went to graduate school. And once I got back from Mexico, I kind of left clay for a really long time. I didn't use it. I was doing a lot of photography. I was making a lot of work with fabric. It was the 90s. And then I went in graduate school. I started to research the history of the decorative. And I was spending a lot of time at the Costume Institute at the Met. And I had this wonderful professor named Richard Martin. And through that process, I really sort of deeply went into looking at the decorative. And I was, as I said, I was doing a lot of fabric work. And at the same time, I started to realize that I knew how to use this material that so implicitly talked about it. It was kind of the perfect material. There's pots. I mean, at the Met in New York, it's actually one of the largest collections of ceramics. And they have over almost half of the collection at the museum is made of clay. So I just was spending hours there and really sort of diving into it. And for a long time, I was working with photography and pots. And then I finally realized that there was this power in a pot. Like, it was this incredible form that had this intense history. And there must be some way I could use it, both through my absolute love of it, just formally, as well as the conceptual value of it. So that's how all of this work, in a nutshell, kind of came to be. And so here, I'm just going to take you through a couple of shows. This was from 2005, and it is from my G-Pot series. I was really lucky. My husband was on a Fulbright to Turkey, and I was really lucky to go there and spend some time with him. And while I was there, I deeply discovered Hittite pottery. And I sort of fell in love with all of the forms, the long bottom pointed forms that they would just stick into the ground, and the big handles that they would use to sort of tie to horses, that all of these pots were made for function and use. And I started to wonder what possibly could be the use value of a pot in our contemporary culture. I mean, we have Pottery Barn, we have all these things that sort of make it completely not viable anymore. So with that, and sort of my research of the decorative and adornment, I sort of came up with these pieces. And they were called my G-pots. And they were sort of deeply reflecting what is function and what is adornment. And then from there, I moved on to keep thinking about this. And instead of thinking about the surface of pieces, I started to sort of think about the structure of pieces. And instead of pieces being covered with adornment, the adornment and the decorative sort of came from the structuring of a piece and the piling up of pieces, and how the actual physical making could discuss that. So that's what this show was. It was a show on restitutions, and it was in Boston. It was right when a lot of pots were flying back to Europe. And this show was about the 13 pots that got sent from the MFA back to Italy. And at the same time, this is, I think, when I really started to learn about clay, and I really started to investigate it in a new way, in the sense that I was starting to realize this idea that's been intrinsic to my work ever since, that clay sort of is this amazing material to work with because it exists between the 2D and 3D. It is, you're always building with it and making form, and then you fire it, and then you have to deal with glaze, and you have to deal with surface. So you're always kind of going back and forth between these two places, and it's kind of the space that doesn't really exist, but yet it does physically exist, but you're kind of in this sort of etheric floating space of the two, I feel like, when you're constantly working with it. And so with that, I started to investigate painting and using imagery. The other thing that kind of came out during this time was there was in in the sort of fine arts world, I was deeply referencing these historical pots. And there wasn't a lot of history of it in the fine arts world, as well as sort of in the knowledge of the viewer was coming to the pieces with. So I felt like I needed to give them a little bit more. And so a lot of these drawings that I'm doing, some of them do, as you might be able to see, have little pieces of George Ohr pots in them. And then there are also pieces, collections of my pots, historical Greek and Roman pots, and I sort of put them together, and I started to feel like they were my reading rooms. And I would kind of have them for information for the viewer so that they could somehow like dive into this history that I was deeply talking about. And here's another one. I think you might be able to see in the handle up above, there's a little George Ohr glaze. So you can see that he's been there for a really, really long time in my work. And then along with the vessel I had been working with for a really long time, but then the more I worked with clay, the more I realized that there's two different materials when you're working with it. Like in the 2D and the 3D, there's clay and there's glaze. And so I started to learn that in a pot, the glaze is always going to move this way due to gravity, and how is there any way that I can sort of change that so that I can show that this material does something different when used in different ways, and that the two are inherently different. So I started to play around with different forms, started to make some wall pieces that would sort of discuss it all the more. This was a show that was from about 2 years ago, and it's called In and Out of Weeks. And I've always been kind of interested in ideas of object versus sculpture, which is something that obviously inherently comes from working the material I do. But and what is the difference between an object and a sculpture, and object and support, just sort of really investigating really basic sculptural concerns, but yet putting them into sort of a deeper conceptual context because of the material being used. Here are some other images of that. And then that finally sort of gets me to the show that's up there right now, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that. I guess it was about 4 years ago now, I went into a deep sort of time of trying to learn about utopian societies. There had been a lot of work being made about utopian culture and societies, and as much as I've always been incredibly attracted to it, like I was always obsessed with like the 60s and communes, and the more work I saw about it, the more I started to question it, like why am I not sort of really loving this work? And I couldn't figure out why. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on, as I usually do when I go into states like this. And I started to realize that it was more about sort of this idea of equality and use value, which I think so ties into function, but that was more interesting to me than why this culture or why this group of people existed. It was more how they existed than why they existed. And so the last show I showed you, as well as this show, sort of deeply researches that and sort of my own thoughts on that. And really it sort of came out into this idea of thinking about the materials I'm using, be it clay, be it wood, be it paint, be it saran wrap, wood, whatever I'm using needs in some way to be used for its intrinsic use value. And it needs to be used for some reason that another material couldn't be used. So it's kind of this structure that I set up for myself about that to sort of dictate kind of this space of conceptual understanding about materials that I so learned from working with clay and sort of this long investigation of working with clay. So that sort of is a very quick nutshell of all of this, and I'm happy to answer more questions, but I know a lot of you came here to hear about George Ohr. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a lead-in as to why I loved Ohr. So I've never given a talk like this on another artist, so I'm going to have to read to you. But here I go, and let me see if I figure this out. Okay, here I go. When I was thinking about this talk, I decided to read everything I could get my hands on about Ohr. I read a lovely short story of which he starred in, written at the turn of the century, and many of the numerous books which have been written in the past few years. I learned much about him, much of which I will share. One of the most telling things, though, came from a conversation with my 9-year-old son over lunch about a week ago. I asked him if he always knew of Ohr and what he thought of him. His response was, of course I know of Ohr. You and Dad talk about him at least once a week at dinner. I know his work well. When I was little, I thought he was a past president, not an artist. This somehow fits in perfectly with my thoughts to be explained, that Ohr is in many ways within the patrimony of American art. He was a founding force in what truly rethought and restructured a Eurocentric art making. Okay, there we go. I've always loved Ohr. I've always been inspired by him and sought to understand him. However, I've always done that as an artist and not as an academic. I cannot speak to you all from a position of known authority as an academic on Ohr could. While working on this, I questioned deeply what authority is and how that can exist in my life and my making. The only thing I can claim any sort of authority to is my work and my parenting, not my children for sure, but what I do with them. Of course, Ohr knew this way ahead of me. One of the first and most telling things I ever learned about him was that he called all of his pieces his clay babies and all of his 10 children his live potteries. He united art and technical labor fully into everyday life. He had no division of life and making. His conceptual concerns engulfed every part of his existence. He is the ideal form of social practice in so many ways. First, let's get a time frame and some understanding of his life. George Edgar Ohr was born in Biloxi on July 10, 1857. His father established the first blacksmith shop in Biloxi. George worked in his studio for a bit and then drifted on to other part-time jobs. His first introduction to clay was at 19. In 1879, he was offered an apprenticeship to Joseph Fortune Mayer's Pottery studio. In 1881, Ohr jumps on a freight train and tours through 16 states, visiting as many potters and studios as he can. One of major influence was the brother Kirkpatrick in Illinois. In 1882, he starts working at the William Virgin Pottery in New Orleans, eventually becoming Newcomb Pottery. A year later, in 1883, George goes back to Biloxi and builds his first studio with his savings of $26.80. George marries Josephine Gearing, September 15, 1886. First child, Ella Louise, born in 1887. She dies a few months later. In the next 13 years, they would have 9 more children, a few of whom who did not live past childhood. Ohr begins referring to himself as an art potter in 1891. In 1894, a devastating fire destroys Ohr's studio. At the same time, he begins to get public attention in newspapers. A year later, Ohr builds a small home in a 5-story pink pagoda pottery and names it Biloxi Art Pottery Unlimited. In 1899, unprompted, Ohr sends 8 pieces to the Smithsonian. They were chipped and broken due to improper handling. They were accessioned 87 years later. By 1901, Ohr begins to investigate pure clay form and is not as intrigued by glaze. In 1903, he stops using glaze entirely to focus on more sculptural works. In 1904, Ohr won a silver medal at the Louisiana Purchase International Exhibition in St. Louis. In 1905, Ohr's mother dies and wills land to Josephine and his surviving siblings. A year later, in 1906, dispute over family land begins. In 1909, George begins to give up making work. He is also faced with a lunacy hearing due to anger over family land dispute with his siblings. He was determined sane on April 3rd. He had many appearances in the newspaper, reports of numerous arrests, as well as eloquent letters written in protest of the state of the prisons and treatment of citizens. In 1910, he made his last pot. Sons convert his studio into Ohr Boys Auto Repairing Shop. He was again arrested for public anger due to his family's property being resold for a substantial profit. On Sunday, April 7, 1918, at 3:10 a.m., George E. Ohr died of throat cancer at the age of 60. He left about 7,000 mud babies stored in open crates in his attic. They remained there until 1968, when James W. Carpenter, an antiques dealer from Montague, New Jersey, arrived in Biloxi to search for his specialty, old cars, preferably a Cadillac or Model T, at the auto repair shop owned by Ohr's sons. They showed him the crates, and he wanted to purchase all of the pots. 2 years later, they agreed, and they were all sold for about $50,000. Ohr believed all of his work was a whole and thought it should all exist as one piece, not as many pots. In 1972, Mr. Carpenter began to sell the pieces individually from $40 to $1,200. About 500 of Ohr's bisque pieces were presumed to be unfinished and glazed by dealers, which naturally ruined them. The pots pale in comparison to Ohr's glazing techniques. There are numerous stories that continue after this to give rise to Ohr. There's, of course, Jasper John's paintings. He did a whole show at Castelli that was based off one Ohr pot he had collected. Rauschenberg, Warhol, Gehry, and many others were inspired. His work became known and shown at numerous museums. His first major show in 1989 in New York at the American Crafts Museum. His work was finally accessioned into the Smithsonian. He became a reference point for so much conversation on craft and art, and now there's finally a museum dedicated to him. What I've crystallized from all this research and intense focus is that I love his pots. They are amazing, truly. I could just sit here and point and say, look at that one, it is fabulous. I've spent days over the past 24 years doing this. They are pure visual pleasure, very small. These 4 by 8 inch pots are masterful sculpture. They can hold a room on their own, each one bringing so much information and joy to the viewer. The color is rough and unpleasant and gorgeous. The form is fluid and awkward. They are harmonizing beauty. Words which have been used to describe them, decadent and misshapen, festering, leprotic, intestinal, bloody, erotic, beautiful, opulent, humorous, rough, etheric, challenging, wacky. They possess a clear interior and exterior. They are complete. I've begun to truly understand that for me, it's these miraculous pots in connection with all of his other work that you are looking at above, which I have learned so much from. It's his multidisciplinary and avant-garde approach to all materials and processes he came in contact with. His work involves form, color, poetry, semiotics, performance, collage, architecture, community, and early use of media. He seamlessly embodies all of it. All form parts of a single whole. It can be seen as a single flowing line. I spend a lot of time thinking about clay. What is clay? What is ceramics? And both clay and glaze as materials. I have attempted to separate them in my work and use them for their inherent value. It is beautiful to see how Ohr did this through the trajectory of his career. He began with making functional objects, then moved on to trinkets and tourist pieces, although he never abandoned these, maybe financially, but I think he also had a lot of fun making them. He then moved on to his pots. His early pieces are more based in recognizable form, Greek and Roman vessels, high Baroque, and are not so intensely glazed. As he moved deeper into his investigations, the forms become less symmetrical, the glazing more intricate and experimental. I can say from working with the pot that breaking symmetry is not easy. It may be even harder on the wheel, which sort of dictates it. There's something about the pot shape that is in our DNA, the elegance and dignity of form. We have a bodily relationship with it. It is real work to attempt to manipulate and change the silhouette while maintaining grace and energy and not being somewhat obvious. He did this brilliantly. Then, after about 25 years of making, he starts to abandon glaze. He uses clay as pure form, not a relationship of surface and form. The early pieces from this time have some glaze lines and drips of it. The later works, he begins to use two different types of clay and colors of clay that act as the surface information. By doing this, he actually transforms the idea of ceramics. It's not an object anymore. It cannot be fetishized as a pot or function. It's truly sculpture existing in 6 inches of clay. It's a major departure in his work and actually in the conversation of craft and art. He takes a craft material, embodies it with the concepts of utility, and makes pure art. He deeply understood performance and used it in so many ways. When working with clay, I have learned that it's a constant moment of awareness, almost a performance-like relationship. It's of now, this moment, not of next Tuesday.
It's incredibly time-based, not to sound cheesy, but it's somewhat of a dance between maker and material. It records everything, every mark, every movement, every moment. There are rules which cannot be broken to get through the process, but it works best when these are challenged and twisted. He understood this presence, as one can see in the vitality of the wares, but he also discussed it in many other ways. He designed a portable kiln that he would take with him to shows and fairs. He traveled with his wheel and put on a show of sorts with his throwing, which he was masterful. I quote Ohr, "This is what I do with a ball of clay on the wheel, blindfolded. Turn a jug, put a corn cob or stopper in it, change the corn cob into a funnel, have the funnel disappear and have a jar, change the jar into an urn, and half a dozen other shapes, and turn anything that anyone in the USA can mention that is cylindrical on the potter's wheel." Along with this, he appeared in costume on numerous occasions as ongoing performances and happenings. A favorite of mine is Ohr as Father Time. He used the camera and staged images of his work, of him, of his house, of his family, of his studio. He used language brilliantly. He created his own unique phonetic and text-like language. It was not easy for the viewer and needed time and thought to be deciphered or read. One of my favorite play on words of Ohr is from a sign at the World's Fair, which always makes me laugh. And the potter said to clay, "Beware," and it was. And some of the, I know it's a really geeky ceramic joke, but and some of the most powerful work to me is the advertisements, editorials, statements, conversations, and just pieces of art that he had printed in local publications and newspapers. At times they embodied this Ohr-like speech, at other times they were eloquent and cleanly written, all dependent on what he was trying to do. When I'm thinking about them and looking at them, I can float to that all-famous and inspirational art format of Linda Benglis in 1974. They both sharply used the media for deeply political purpose. Political practice is something that I saw in Ohr's work, but I never really knew about some of the influences or causes promoted. I don't know why I never put it together, but of course, it was the turn of the century, one of my favorite times for much of its political, social, and spiritual embodiments. It was a time of deep spiritual crisis from the Industrial Revolution. It was a time of the Shakers, the Anthroposophists, the Transcendentalists, Emerson, and the arts and crafts movement. All this became a part of Ohr's conversation. Socialism was a way to organize society so that all human effort and existence mattered. It held value of and in manual labor. People sought a fair and balanced life, equality. He was a supporter and sympathizer of the movement. There is no proof that he joined. However, he took the cause deep into his life through his practice. There was a local socialist paper, Appeal to Reason, which Ohr promised a monthly 12-inch vase, which of course would be one of a kind, which would go to the member who collected the greatest amount of subscribers. He would inscribe it, "Presented to, by the Appeal to Reason, for the meritorious service in the cause of socialism." There was a cooperative colony formed in 1890 on the Gulf Coast, which was called Coapolis Clay. It was made up of mostly populists and supporters of collectives, farmers, and workers. They became self-sufficient as a community. Ohr did not join, but endorsed the clay and products made. All of this he took political action in, but probably the most socialist act of Ohr's was the conceptual value of function, which was embodied in all of his work. His materials used, clay, media, and photography, had the base idea of from and for the people. He took this on with vigor. All of this comes back to the fullness of practice, this ability to take whatever is needed to complete a conceptual concern, to study something fully and completely, from digging and hauling his clay from a local riverbank, to spending hours and hours working on a wheel, to experimenting with new media when he saw fit. That engrossment allowed for space to discuss something new, understand something more about the world in which we exist, the community around us. He translated his knowledge of material into a radical and political framework. Ohr was a revolutionary and continues to be. His work is about clay, about earth, about humanity, about being. It is beautiful, grotesque, abject, and present. It hides nothing or any part of the process. It is truly visceral in a way that we did not really see again until Pollock. He fully and completely embraced and created a language of abstraction. His omnipresent idea that a utilitarian object could embody meaning beyond its purpose, we see again 20 years later from Duchamp. He was interested in the notion of the banal and how it could be invested with conceptual and philosophical significance, much like minimalism. He used language on form, which connects to 70s conceptual art. We can also see the folded forms of another one of my true heroes, Hannah Wilke. He manipulated and restructured words in newspapers, signs, and in live performances. He created a postmodern persona. Ohr's work is about the other, being exposed to the elements and somehow surviving, attempting to control the earth around us, or maybe better, making conversation of what is around us and asking for change. He is the educated and eloquent common laborer. This relates to me to the American vernacular and is deeply reflected in the art movements of the United States for the past century, a strange crossbreed of craft and art. To quote a critic of his time, one of his only supporters, Ohr's creations defy reverent ideas of nature and represent deeper messages about the human condition, perpetual struggle with life's meaning, and modern perceptions of individual value. I think I can say that he is in some way a part of the inheritance of American art. He is a history. He understood and made a signifier of a new conversation. To end with a quote by Ohr, the mystic, from 1898, I am making pottery for art's sake, God's sake, the future generation, and by present indications for my own satisfaction. But when I'm gone, like Palissy, my work will be prized, honored, and cherished. Sorry. And finally, here's an image of my exhibition upstairs in a pot by Ohr. I found this recently during one of my long Ohr days. He so eloquently and concisely says all that I hope to discuss in 6 inches. Thank you all so much for your time. I mean, I think I just kind of said all that there is this embodiment of concept in his work that it was actually really interesting. I'm going to go on a long rambled answer, but when I started to do a lot of the reading about his work, at first I was like very nervous to be able to present Ohr, because as I said, I'm not an authority, an academic authority on it. And as I began reading, the more and more I read, the more I sort of got like, I wouldn't say angry was the right word, but I just kept being like, no, they're wrong. Like there was like this part of me that kept coming out that was like, they're not really looking at this, they're looking at this as like, from an exterior source, they're not looking at it from an interior place. And so it made me actually realize that there was this deep connection of this understanding of a material, and through that understanding of a material, creating a conversation based in the concept of utility. And I think that would probably be the easiest way to answer your question, that of all of these things that I'm putting out there, I feel that when it all comes down at the very end, I have this long-winded version of talking about the exact same thing that he did in 6 inches. He has I could just very quickly do it. There's the adornment that he puts on the pot. He breaks the silhouette. He deals with surface. There's sort of this interior that's not glazed, this exterior that's glazed, sort of this movement from the inside to the outside. Is sort of very much showing what the material of clay is and what it can hold, and sort of this, the concept of utility of function and the use value. And I think that like when I sort of can strip my work bare, when it comes right down to it, it's this constant discussion of what is function. And I can put it into many different contexts, but that from working with material is what
my sort of daily existence of conversation is.
Hello. Yes,
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I wanted to talk about the last slide.
We can get to it.
There's two things that I would like to comment about, and if you can please help me to add on it. It seems like, I feel like his work and your work embraced an accumulation of memory in terms of styles from different times. And somehow they end up reflecting a collage of all that. I mean, it's like they have no time where you can inscribe them. Yet, in your case, there's certain things that I didn't hear tonight, and it is the nature of the display that you use to incorporate your pieces on, and the geometry, much more rigid, that you use, the shelf, the pedestals, and in some cases you even treat that support as part. You will tell me later, but I wonder if this is something that you got informed from another practice?
Well, I mean, yeah, I look at much work. I mean, George Ohr has always been like one of my founding fathers, maybe I could say. But I spend much time looking at a lot of other work, a lot of painting, a lot of contemporary sculpture, a lot of historical sculpture. So a lot of it, like I sort of briefly said at the beginning, is sort of this journey into what is sculpture, and the idea of sort of object and support and a challenge of the two, and how you can change object to sculpture and what that actually means. So that's where a lot of this sort of balancing of materials comes from. And they're all sort of inherently a part of the piece. Like the piece as a whole, they're always deeply considered. I don't know, does that answer your question, or is there more to it? Yeah?
Have reference ancient vessels. Is there any evidence in the reading that you've done that he studied any other cultures?
That's the thing that I found so interesting when I was doing all of this research on him, is that he always has this like mad Potter of Biloxi sort of genre and sort of this like way he's presented. And we always sort of can see the most interesting, like much like when I was going back to sort of this like angered position of like, no, he wasn't thinking that. He educated himself incredibly. And he knew about art history. I mean, even like that quote that I just gave you about Palissy, like he knew of him when he was sort of getting billed as this like crazy potter from Biloxi who like didn't know anything but just made these mad, wonderful pots. And like a lot of the imagery that he does in the staged photographs, like if you really look at them, they like very much reference art history. So and a lot of the, some of the readings that I did, which were sort of much more of his eloquently written pieces, he deeply knew the history of art, and he was deeply aware of it, and he was deeply aware of the arts and crafts movement, and he was deeply aware that his work was way more understood in the North than the South, and he very much was always trying to get it up there. And so the thing for me that's really interesting, this is my favorite quote, the thing for me that's really interesting is when you start to look at his work from that perspective, that he was a very sort of educated artist, it starts to look really different. Like you understand all of the references to art history that he's using. And so I just think that's an interesting way to come and look at it, as opposed to sort of looking at it as this raw genius that just sort of started creating this crazy stuff, you know, he worked with pure knowledge. I mean, that's how I feel. So, I know, and sort of my sort of deep research of his work. Like, there's no way he could make these forms without knowing, one, the history of pottery, and then also just the history of art.
Hi, I had a question. I was wondering, in your research, and I'm assuming you've handled some of Ohr's work?
I actually haven't.
No?
No, but I'm going to tomorrow.
Oh,
I know,
great.
I know. I've been near many of them. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things I'm curious about is that they very much feel to me like you want to touch them. There's an invitation of wanting to hold them, touch them, handle them. And I'm wondering if you take that into your own work at all, that idea of touch.
Very much so. I remember reading a review in the New Yorker by, I always make a mess of his name, Peter Shedal. Yes, okay. And he was, actually no, it wasn't a review in the New Yorker. He was giving a talk at the graduation talk at Alfred University, which has one of the biggest ceramics departments, I think probably in the world. And he started talking about the use of clay. And he started talking about the idea of vision and viewing. And he was talking about how there's different types to view. And there is, when you're looking at architecture, you're kind of looking at it from about 20 feet away or further. So you have this sort of grand scale of it. And when you're looking at sculpture and art, you're sort of within this like 5 to like 7 foot range, hopefully, view of it. And when you have a very different relationship to clay. Like clay is part of your everyday existence. Like you do everything with it. You drink out of it, you go to the bathroom on it, a lot of buildings are made out of it, you know, like it's everywhere. And so your natural sort of implication is to get closer to it. And I think that's something that is really, really powerful about using the material. And it's something that I am always thinking about and trying to make present in the work. And that can either be through like the lusciousness of surface, I think, or it can be from just sort of leaving a finger mark in it and sort of trying to get up closer to see that. But the material itself dictates that. And I think that's something that's really special about it, that a lot of materials don't hold.
Just a quick question. Could you say, have you studied how he displayed his work, like installed his work? We see it in the images, but maybe you talked about world fairs and things. Could you talk a little bit about how he presented his work for sale or
Well, here's one coming. I don't know how to stop it, so I can't, but look. He exhibited as a big whole. Like the shots that you see of his studio are exactly how it would be if you entered. When he did the world fairs, he would set up something like that. From what I know from images, he would set up something like that, and then he would literally be throwing and firing pieces as it kind of went. But I think the interesting part of it is that he would go do all these world fairs, but he had a deep feeling that his work should be a whole. And that he was almost never upset that it wasn't selling, because it should have been sold as a whole. Yet he would still go do the world fairs, so there's kind of a weird line in there, but I guess you have to eat. But he had a lot of kids. Yeah, so he thought, I mean, he spent a really long time planning his studio, his giant pink pagoda studio. So all of that, I think, was a deep concern of his. And it was at the time of, if we think about what's going on, sort of like, it was a time of salon painting, you know, so it makes sense that he would build these structures that would have tons and tons of pots on them.
At the World's Fair in 1904, he specifically told them at the fair, do not sell one of my pieces ever unless I can get an artist price for artist work. And the price of the work was its weight in gold. And gold was $20.63 an ounce. And if you wanted to buy a piece of ore, you would have to pay between maybe $200 to $300 for a piece of ore. Nobody believes the myth that he chased people down to get his pieces back once it was sold. That never happened.
Do you have time for one more? Is there any more questions? Okay, then we'll end there. One more.
I'm sorry, and I'm sorry my ignorance. As you can hear already, I come from abroad, so it's total discovery for me. Thank you very, very, very much. It's really deeply moving. And one thing you didn't mention, and sorry again if it's totally inappropriate, is about repetition. Maybe there is not, but the other clay artist I could think of, the relation between the body and the material, that was really beautiful how you mentioned it, but the idea of repetition is also something physically and philosophically interesting. I don't know if it's anything related. Maybe there is no repetition.
I mean, it's completely related, because if you think of sort of the act of the potter, I mean, it's kind of this incredible process. Like I always say, like they were the first minimalists in some ways, you know, like just sort of this sitting at the wheel. A couple of years ago, I tried to do this project. My husband's a potter, and so I spend a lot of time looking and thinking about pottery. And a couple of years ago, I tried to sit down every day and throw 3 balls of clay and make the exact same bowl. And it proved to be truly the hardest thing I've ever done. And every day I would kind of write about it and like sort of learn this idea of the internal versus the exterior and try to make the shape sort of match and go back and forth. And my frustration finally led into the idea that the whole project was just like my love of my husband. But but what I truly ended up learning from it is that it is like this repetition of making, you know, is I think in some ways some of what I was talking about in sort of this, his ability to actually truly enter and understand something was because he did it so many times. And you can be a potter and do the same thing 100 times and never enter that space very easily, or like you could be a painter and paint the exact same painting and never enter that space, or you get into that moment of minutia. And I think he so beautifully entered it, but full of thought, that I don't know, like it, to me, whenever I truly think of that repetitive process, I do really go to like thinking about minimalism and thinking about this space of allowing, the difference to me is when I go and look at a piece of minimalist sculpture, I'm there to look at it to get that idea. Whereas for him, and I probably for most potters, they're in that idea. They like sort of exist within it, and I think it's kind of this incredibly beautiful space.